Hi, nice to have you with us. I highly recommend that you read John 21 before listening to today's homily. The Gospel of John has two resurrection stories, and John 21 is the second of them. And it's quite different from the first one, so the obvious question is, why is there a second one? What does the author want us to know? And I think much the answer lies in these three sentences from verse 9. When they had gone ashore, the disciples, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. So here's some of the background to this passage. The Sea of Galilee was a renowned source of fishing and the fish that came from it at the time of Jesus. And fish from Galilee made its way all through Israel and even ended up being exported to surrounding territories, including Rome. And the primary town on the Sea of Galilee for sorting and processing fish was the town of Magdala, perhaps better known as the town from which Mary Magdalene came from. That's where the Magdalene is. And two key things happened with fish at Magdala. Firstly, the fish were sorted into three separate sizes, like buying clothes: small, medium, and large. The smaller, the cheapest ones were typically eaten by the poor. The medium-sized fish were eaten by the wealthy, and the large ones were largely reserved for the wealthy and powerful. And of course, there was a second industry that happened with those fish as well. Those smaller ones were dried and salted, and that would have helped with preservation and also therefore distribution around the territory. And it was a delicacy for both rich and for poor. But then, as we learn so often in the New Testament, Rome was not only cruel in the way that they crucified people physically, they were also fond of crucifying people economically wherever the empire went. So with Galilee, they did two things. The first thing we see is revealed in verse 1 of our reading today. It says, "After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias." And he showed himself in this way. So everywhere else in the Gospels, this sea, and the sea is, by the way, just a large inland lake, a very large inland lake. But this sea was typically called the Sea of Galilee. But suddenly in the second resurrection story, it's no longer the Sea of Galilee, now it's called the Sea of Tiberias. And Rome, as part of its typical economic raping of the lands that they occupied, claimed the Sea of Galilee for itself. If you like, Caesar baptized it, renamed it after Rome's second emperor. But it wasn't just a naming, it was also a claiming. By renaming the Sea of Galilee, Caesar was saying, this lake, and not just the lake, but also all the fish in it, now belong to me. Therefore, anyone who takes a fish out of the sea actually owes me some money for it. It's a tax, because all the fish in the sea belong to me. And if that weren't enough, because that's really bad enough, if that weren't enough, they went on and did a second thing. Knowing the popularity of Magdala's fish, that processing plant, Rome went and established a new town just a few kilometers away from Magdala, also on the shore of what was now called the Sea of Tiberias. And so not only would Rome now tax the fish that were caught, they would also undermine Israel's renowned fish processing business by starting their own fish processing business in Tiberias, and therefore putting people out of work. I don't know if you remember, if you've seen the movie You've Got Mail, but what Rome did to Magdala in those years was like that big corporate bookstore, setting up shop just around the corner from the little private bookstore that had been there for decades. Rome, even if it wasn't its intentional aim, which I think it probably was, but its goal would have been ultimately to put Magdala out of business. It's just another story of corporate raiding, national raiding, the rich and the powerful stomping on the poor and the vulnerable. Now that we know that background, let's get back to our resurrection story. So, in our reading today, we heard, you might remember, that when the disciples come ashore, when Jesus calls them ashore, there's already a fire with fish on it. And Jesus offers them some bread as well. A fire with fish, cooking, it's there. In other words, the meal is already prepared. But Jesus goes on and says this curious thing. He says, so bring some of the fish that you have just caught. The meal is ready, but Jesus now wants to add the fish that the disciples have just caught. He wants to add that to their menu. And I think we discover why Jesus wants to do that in the next verse. Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish. 153 of them, full of large fish. Historian and author Diana Butler-Bass points out that people get all excited about that number 153. I remember reading a book about it. A guy got very excited about 153 because preachers use it to tell us that we've got to count the people who come to church on a Sunday, or we must aim to reach as many people for Jesus as we can. And when we do, we've got to keep a count of them like notches on our belt and so on. But Butler-Bass says to us the number 153 in the story is really just a distraction, because the phrase we really should notice is the one that says that the haul of fish was a haul of large fish. Not small, not medium, but large, all large. And that's the heart of this passage. Because the large fish belong to the rich and the powerful. In ordinary circumstances, these fish would have ended up on Herod's plate, on Pilate's plate, on the plates of governors and magistrates and high priests and centurions. And in fact, apparently the Romans had even worked out how to transport fresh fish by boat as far as Rome. So these fish belonged not only in the local area, but they even would have ended up on Caesar's plate. And so Jesus says, bring some of those fish. Bring some of those fish. Bring some of the fish that you have just caught. Bring Caesar's fish to me. Bring Caesar's fish to me. And put it on the fire which I have made. The fire from which we all will eat today. In other words, with that simple instruction, Jesus is saying, Caesar may think he owns the sea, this lake. He may have renamed it, but he does not own it. He may think that these fish belong to him, but they do not. This is God's lake, and these are God's fish. And we will eat these fish without paying Caesar to do so, because these fish belong not to Caesar, but to God. For many weeks now, I've had this thing on my heart. It won't leave me. As followers of Jesus, I want to say today, we can never side with Caesar, whoever Caesar might be, no matter who he or she is. We can never side with Caesar. And nor can we, and this story reminds us of it, nor can we be neutral when Caesar is being cruel. We can never side with Caesar, and we can never be neutral when Caesar is being cruel. Desmond Tutu was right when he said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. When Jesus tells the disciples to bring some of the fish they have caught, he is taking sides. Make no mistake about it, he is taking sides. He's taking sides with those who have been unfairly taxed by Rome. He's taking sides with those who have lost their jobs because Rome went and built Tiberias just up the road from Magdala. He's taking sides with the poor being trampled on by the powerful, the vulnerable being abused. That simple phrase, bring some of the fish you have caught, is the declaration by Jesus that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not, and never will Caesar be. So I want to say today, I'm deeply saddened that the Methodist Church has remained so silent on the war in Ukraine. I don't know why. I haven't found out. But my prayer, my pleading is, please, Lord, let it not be because we as a church are somehow afraid of upsetting Caesar. Please, Lord, let that not be the case. The followers of Jesus can never side with Caesar, no matter who he or she may be. Instead, we are always called to stand alongside those whom Caesar harms. A few weeks ago, my friends Bill and Debbie were telling me about a thing which happened in their neighborhood. They live in the Johannesburg area. And near where they live is a regular group of people who wait on the street corners looking for some piecemeal work. And Bill and Debbie had decided to offer them something to eat each day. And then recently people in their neighborhood began to complain They saw the food as an encouragement for some bad element to come into the area. And by the way, that's an accusation that is leveled at our church often as well. But it's not that Bill and Debbie's neighbors are bad or discompassionate people at all. It's just that we recognize in South Africa, most of us live with some measure of fear for our safety. And this community felt vulnerable by this act of care by Bill and Debbie. So they wrestled with it deeply. They wanted to be good neighbors, honoring their neighbors, but they also wanted to stand with those that Caesar harms. And so they found a compromise. They offer far less food from their own home now and instead take food to the street corners where the workers stand day by day. It's a simple, sacrificial gesture because Jesus is Lord and Caesar isn't and never will be.